David Manning was born in Kew in 1923. Aged 12, he joined the Royal Australian Naval College as a cadet midshipman, but through family financial pressure withdrew in his second year. At the outbreak of World War II, 16-year-old David attempted to enlist but was turned away because of his age. As soon as he turned 18, he successfully reapplied, rejecting a land-based naval commission to join the war effort as an ordinary seaman. David was on board the HMAS Perth as part of a 14-strong Allied fleet when it sailed into a Japanese invasion convoy off the coast of Java. After a 36-hour battle, the Allied fleet was whittled down, the Perth running out of ammunition. Abandoned ship was ordered. David and his fellow sailor, Gavin Campbell, attempted to dive into the water at the same time.
We were both attempting to leave the ship over the rail, down aft on the port side, and the fourth torpedo hit and blew us both off the ship and into the water. I was unharmed, but Gavin had a leg broken. In the water, in its easiest form, I guess, 20 minutes, half an hour after the ship sunk, I found myself getting aboard a floating net, a life-saving net. It was a purely coir net, but it had cork on the cross seam and it floated. And that carried about, hanging onto it, 15 blokes. 12 blokes, and I finished up one of them, climbing on, vomiting ferociously because I'd obviously swallowed a lot of water after I was corkscrewing in the water after the explosion. Stayed on the net all night. After the action had finished, the Japanese destroyer, there was one Japanese destroyer looking for Japanese survivors, and we actually had to fend off from the side of the Japanese destroyer. And we see these little men in their white caps and torches flashing, looking down at us. Somebody on the net was much, much braver than I was because he called out in a very loud voice, Australians and sowing will. Proud of it, you know. I was happy to get on and board a ship if it was there. But anyway, with all due appreciation of the Japanese Navy there, the captain elected to glide past us before he switched on his engines, for which I'm very grateful. After crashing down and sleeping on the beach for the rest of the night, we found that by digging in the sand beyond the high water mark, we found fresh water, brackish, but it was drinkable. The next 5 days, we spent walking across Java, allegedly looking for the Dutch army, and never finding it, but always being told that it was at Manessa, up in the mountains, and we found the Javanese people rather indifferent. They were not aggressive at that stage, but not cooperative either. I and the originals in that particular trip of the boat were all naked, apart from a coating of oil fuel. And I will remember on the second village I walked past an elderly, well, at that time I thought elderly. I'm not sure whether she was these days, but one of the Javanese women came out and gave me a piece of cloth the size of a hand towel, which I discreetly held in place as we walked.
As the survivors made their way into the mountains, the Javanese population became increasingly hostile. At Pandeglang, around 100 kilometres west of Jakarta, the exhausted party was apprehended by locals to wait for Japanese troops.
We were pushed into cells at Pandeglang Jail. And again, my personal story, and it's the only one I can tell you with authority, is that I immediately went to sleep. I felt as if I'd been walking for 5 days up into the mountains barefoot and what have you, so I just died. And I was awakened by a little man screaming at me in a language I didn't know and prodded me in the leg with his bayonet. And my very first thought was, he's not yellow, he's brown. I believe that he was the first Japanese that I had ever seen at close quarters. And that was my first initial reaction. Anyway, we were herded outside into the courtyard of the jail, broken up into Americans and Australians. They ascertained that. And then we were questioned by the English-speaking young officer in charge of the platoon. He said, "What do you want to do?" Deathly silence, except for a voice that came from behind me belonging to a bloke by the name of Charlie Goodchap. He was an incorrigible arrogant. Said, "Tell him we want to go home." The Japanese had carefully choreographed our exit. They had a large crowd of intimidated or enthused, whichever way you want to look at it, Javanese, all armed with a piece of bamboo, who made us run the gauntlet, beating us with bamboo, purely for propaganda purposes. We are here. We're here to relieve the Javanese of Dutch oppression. Serang turned out to be the central point to which all the prisoners who were being taken, that either those from the ships or whatever. And there were two sides. One was the jail and the other was the local picture theatre. I went to the picture theatre. The conditions were horrendous, for the want of a better word. We had to squat on the tile floor. We squatted all day. We were not permitted to talk, relax, do it. If there was any movement at all, somebody would come along and kick us back into submission. And we got 2 meals a day, both almost inedible, but the second one was the big one. That was a bowl of rice with we're quite sure it was seaweed soup on it.
David was transferred from the cinema to the overcrowded jail. It was there he met journalist and war correspondent Rowan Rivette.
I hadn't been in the jail for very long before I decided to go get some exercise, which meant walking from one end of the cell to the other and back again and picking your way over bodies. When I got to the other end, on a whitewashed wall, there was an oval drawn with 4 sticks at either end. And I just stopped and said, "Who's the Australian rules football fan?" And this red-headed bundle in the corner poked his head up and said, "Me, who do you barrack for?" And I said, "Essendon." And he said, "Fitzroy." And that was the start of a lifelong friendship, all because of a love of Australian rules football. We arrived in Burma, in a place called Tambasayat, which was the Burma starting point of the railway line. At the end of October in 1942. We went to our first camp at the 8 kilo camp. Now, there's a difference between Burma and Thailand. The Thai camps went to established, named areas. In Burma, that didn't happen, and all camps became known as their 8 kilo, 17 kilo, 25 kilo, which were the distances from Tambasayat. And our first job, of course, was clearing jungle. I was suffering blackouts at the time. These had started in the jail at Serang. By the time I was on the railway line, I was blacking out fairly consistently, twice a week, perhaps more. And no warning, I just go, and people originally used to worry about me. After a while, they'd step over me, that's the way it was. But and it was in that camp that I first met Coates. Coates, this was his first camp in the railway line area. He'd come up the coast from Sumatra at other places, but this is 6 months after the capitulation, or longer. But he was the senior officer, a senior medical officer at the 8 kilo camp. Eventually, they decided that I was a menace to life and limb and to what we were doing, if we were chopping trees down or what have you. And he sent me back to the base camp at Tambasayat. I never really saw Coates again, except fleetingly on my eventual way along the railway line. I went the 55 kilo, by which time he was had established a hospital, inverted commas, which was the principal treatment area for fellows on the Burma side. And it took me quite a few months to sort of leapfrog along the line. I was in Tambasayat for about a month, as was Rowan, at the same time when it was bombed out by the United States Air Force. And we had to evacuate Tambasayat camp, and we went out of camp a little to more other stories, but the gist of what I'm trying to say is that led to me rejoining the workforce as we went along the line. But I never caught up again with my Perth fellows until the railway line was virtually finished some months later. The trouble wasn't as originally anticipated as the diet. The medical opinion that was offered to me in Tambasayat by Coates at the camp and Fisher back at Tambasayat was that I was suffering from a blast problem from having been blown off the ship by the torpedo. Coates was the outstanding medical man on the line, and he was not alone. He had 20-odd others who did brilliant jobs, absolutely brilliant jobs, and service above self at all times, for what it's worth. Yeah, but Coates was a remarkable man. He was largely responsible for my going back from the 8 kilo camp to Thameside, and for that I have a personal reason to be grateful to him. My story was negligible beside the stories of others with amputations and things like that, and the things that he did were just almost beyond comprehension. People like Dunlop is a prime example of reducing death ratios. He took over English camps that were hotbeds of death and turned them into livable places. And in that sense, he was a remarkable man. I think his real abilities as a camp commandant, whereas Coates did wondrous things medically, particularly at the 55 kilo camp, under conditions that were impossible to describe, absolutely impossible. A sense of, any sense of achievement was lost in the conditions. I don't talk about them particularly. It's never been my scene to tell my family or anybody else what the conditions were. Anybody can read a book, and a lot of people have already described it. All I can say is that if you read anything at all, Rowan's book, the original one, Behind Bamboo, covers it well, and there are about dozens and dozens of others. There's nothing that I can add to them, nothing I want to add to them. I would believe that the great majority of them are spot on. Sometimes you get carried away, people get carried away, and imagination might make it a little bit worse, but it was very difficult to make it worse than it really was. No, it wasn't an experience to give you any satisfaction at all. You knew the thing was finished, and all you could say was, thank God for that, you know. I'm not sure what's next, but it couldn't be worse, which it wasn't. Things improved. But the death ratios on the railway line were practically unbelievable. We were told that we would be assembled at whatever time it was, which is what happened. We went out into the rubber plantation to find that the entire Japanese battalion was there in full uniform, rifles, the whole lot, and we were in the middle of them, and it was a tricky situation. Your first thoughts on the subject were, what's happening? Not quite sure about this. Don't like to be in the midst of a lot of armed Japanese guards. And that was when the commanding officer arrived, climbed onto his box, made a long speech in Japanese, of which we understood not a word. But when he finished, he turned to us and bowed, and we knew that moment that the war was over. 2 days later, we were loaded back into our cattle truck in the train going towards Bangkok, and we got confirmation from the local ties that the war has won with a boom, with a big bomb. Of course, we didn't know what an atom bomb was. And the night before we got to a place called Retpuri, which we assumed was going to be our destination. There arrived in the middle of the night, to much consternation, a single British commando officer, and he announced to the Japanese that he was taking charge. 2 or 3 days at the most later, the American Air Force flew in at Dakota to take all the Americans out, and did so because there weren't very many Americans. But they announced that they would take out an aircraft full on a regular basis, one from each nationality, until the RAF took over. The only problem there was that the US Air Force flew us to Rangoon. Then the RAF took over within a day or two and flew everybody else to Bangkok. And the sailors were stuck in Rangoon. Nobody wanted us, nobody owned us. And they by Haig's another story. But eventually we were found by a Royal Australian Air Force wing commander who was out looking for the odds and bods like us. It happened to be Vic Richardson, the old Australian captain, test captain, the grandfather of the Chapel boys. And I know why the Chapels are bits of larrikins, because so was their grandfather. But nobody wanted to own us in Rangoon. It was British Army and that was that. And eventually, after another week or more, Vic came in one day and said, well, there's a ship called the Highland Brigade that's heading from Rangoon to Singapore this afternoon. They won't take you, but, well, the but was enough. We all climbed aboard some jeeps that we'd commandeered and drove down to the ship, got on the Highland Brigade and said, well, here we are.
David spent 3.5 years as a prisoner of the Japanese. On his return to Australia, he married Audrey, with whom he had 3 children. David has played a very active role in Rotary and to this day volunteers at Sovereign Hills Gold Museum.